evening, everybody, and really thank you for coming here. My name is Autocracies. I am a finance and economics professor here and the director, faculty director, founder of the Corporations and Society Initiative, which is sponsoring this event. We also have a collaboration with the Center for Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law in a program on capitalism and democracy that we just launched earlier this year. What all of this is trying to talk about is about institutions in the private sector and in government and how power is distributed, how rules are made and enforced. That's what it's ultimately about. Does the system work? Can we make it work? So to serve, society. So a few words about CASI. CASI is a collaboration. It's about 6 years old now. It's a collaboration of faculty, students, and staff. It's really powered very importantly by student leaders, one of whom is taking the initiative and is a lead on this event and will moderate it, Rachel Hirsch. And a few others are scattered in the room helping us with a big Zoom audience. One is in an overflow room that we have for this event, very popular event. So we collaborate to make this event and others, and this one is our first this year, so we are super excited about that. I can't think of anybody better to open this year, or in general, to embody everything CASI is about than Bill Browder. So I'll say a few words because I was tasked with giving the short bio. Bill Browder was already visited here, but between the time he visited here in 2023, and actually I should mention first, he's an alum of this school, year of 1989. So he's celebrating his 35th year reunion, so maybe that's the most important in this setting. Otherwise, he is the CEO. He has a new title. He's Sir Bill Browder, and you may have noticed on the website that it said KCMG, which stands for Knight Commander of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael's and St. George. It's an award given to men and women in the United Kingdom for their service. So he's a very distinguished person. In addition, there's much more to say, and I don't want to take too much time, but obviously he's the CEO of Hermitage Capital, and he is the founder and head of Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, author of a 2015 book, Red Notice, and the 2022 book, Freezing Order, which you should read. And if you stick around, you might grab a copy right here, signed by Bill, and with a CASI bookmark. Bill Browder was the biggest foreign investor in Russia until in 2005. He was declared sort of enemy of the people, or so a threat to national security, because he was exposing corruption in state-owned companies. The plot thickens significantly when in 2008 his lawyer Sergei Magnitsky spoke up and then was exposed massive fraud, $230 million, and stolen from the government, potentially by people in the government, so it's pretty thick sort of plot. And for this, he was jailed and tortured and not given medical treatment and ended up dying in jail at age 37. Bill Browder decided to devote much of his energy to correcting that awful tragedy, or trying to do something about it, to bring justice and to remember Sergei Magnitsky. And so his campaign was to create laws that would punish human rights violators through freezing their ill-gotten assets, through bans on visas and other things like that, and that he's responsible for making happen 2012 Magnitsky Act in the United States, 2016 Global Magnitsky Act, which went beyond Russia, and in laws of this kind in Canada, United Kingdom, Baltic States, European Union, and working to have it in more nations. So I feel particularly grateful to have Bill here today and to get to know him because his journey and his experience resonates very, very strongly with me. I am a finance professor who ended up doing what I'm doing today, which is a little bit different, and that's similar to Bill being a financier who ended up being a human rights. And so if you read in this book, you will learn about laws in different countries, about the enforcement of the laws, which he says he's been passionate about since age 11, and is now part of my passion too. So we share a lot of passions about justice, about the system. And so you learn about corruption, you learn about politics, you learn about propaganda, and this issue about truth. Tomorrow we started a little series called Power to Truth, and there's nobody better, so I'll record a little interview with him because there's plenty to talk about, and I also look forward to further collaboration with Bill. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Well, first, thank you, Anat, for the wonderful introduction. And again, would like to thank all of you for being here for Cassie's first event of the year. We are so honored to have you, Sir William, in our presence for the first event. And before we begin, a few notes of housekeeping. First off, we will have about 15 minutes for open Q&A at the end, so please hold your questions. And for those joining via Zoom, please submit your questions via the chat, and we will get to them at the end. The second, please stop by and grab a book at the end. The Cassie bookmark cannot be missed. We would also like to thank you again, Sir William or Bill, for joining us to kick off your 35th reunion from the GSB. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a big accomplishment to have survived.
Well, we're thankful for that too.
Thank you.
So you've, as Anat mentioned, you've had just an abundance of accomplishments in your career after the GSB. But I'd love to quickly start with a bit about your background. So I wouldn't say you have the traditional GSBer turned hedge fund manager upbringing. So could you tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and your family?
Yeah, so I've come from an unusual family. My grandfather was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. And he was so good at organizing the union, this is back in the 1920s, that the Soviets, the communists, spotted him and said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism, why don't you come over to check it out? So my grandfather, Earl Browder, goes to Moscow, 1927. As soon as he gets there, he meets a Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. My father was born there. And then 5 years later, he's sent back to the United States to become head of the American Communist Party. He ran for president against Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940 on the communist ticket. Obviously didn't get very far. He was imprisoned in 1940 for being a communist, pardoned in 1941, expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist, and then viciously persecuted during the McCarthy era for being a communist. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 60 years old. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out a good way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I came up with a great idea. Well, actually, I tried a couple things first. I grew my hair long. You can't tell now. But it grew into an afro. My father still blames my baldness for having grown an afro. That didn't upset my family. I followed the Grateful Dead around. That also didn't upset my family. But then I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist, and that really did. So I became a capitalist, and I came to Stanford Business School. And I enrolled in 1987, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was a very auspicious year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And for all of you MBA students, you'll know that one of the the big challenges in your second year or even your first year is to try to figure out what to do with your life. You're sort of here, this is like a sort of professional school to train you to be in a profession. And I was, not sure what to do with my life, as many of you probably also, or maybe you don't, I don't know. But I went to lots of brown bag lunches. Did they still have brown bag lunches?
Oh yeah, but they don't provide lunch anymore.
And lots of recruiting dinners and all different information sessions and all sorts of nonsense. And nothing resonated with me. And people were all my classmates were getting excited about all the stuff that was being offered on campus, and I just couldn't get excited about it. But then one day I had this epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. And I ended up moving to London. I had several jobs, but the job that defined my life and my career was a job at Salomon Brothers. It doesn't exist anymore, Salomon, but some of you will know of Salomon. Has been immortalized in the book Lyra's Poker, which if you haven't read, I highly, for any person in business school, you have to read Lyra's Poker. It's kind of like required reading. They should probably have a course that requires it. Anyways, I went to Salomon Brothers, and I got a job on the East European investment banking team. And my first assignment was to go to advise a fishing fleet located in a town called Murmansk in Russia. And it was a very low-paying assignment, so they sent me with like the lowest junior guy out there. And the head of the fishing fleet met me at the airport, and he said, "I want to show you one of our ships before we get started." So we go down to the docks, and he shows me this enormous vessel, and it's like 400 feet long. It's on 5 different stories. On the top, they have the nets, and then the next story, they separate the fish from whatever, and then work their way down to the bottom of the ship where they have these canning machines. And so it's like not just a fishing boat, it's an ocean-going factory. I said, "How much does one of these things cost?" $20 million new. "How many do you have in your fleet?" 100. So I did the math, $20 million times 100, $2 billion.
Math tracks.
A lot of ships, a lot of value. What's the average age of your fleet? 7 years. So I don't know much about fishing or shipping or whatever, but I figure 7 years, maybe that makes it half depreciated. So $1 billion worth of ships. And I've been hired by the management of this company to advise them on whether or not to exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51%. And I said, "At what price is the government selling 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. So let me just repeat the math. So there's $1 billion worth of ships, and you can buy 51% for $2.5 million. You don't need a Stanford MBA or a Salomon Brothers banker to tell you that that's a good deal. And so I said, yes, of course you should do that. But I thought to myself, what am I doing advising on this stuff? I need to be investing in this stuff. And so I then, instead of going back to London where I was scheduled to go back, I flew to Moscow, and I get off because I need to know whether this is some kind of anomaly just in the fishing business or whether this is something more widespread. And so I get off the plane in Moscow, and I don't know a single person in Russia other than the head of the fishing fleet, and I don't speak any Russian. But as I'm wandering through Sheremetyevo Airport after I've arrived, I noticed in a little kiosk they're selling a very thin English language yellow page directory, and so I buy it. I go to the Metropole Hotel in Red Square. I wake up the next morning and I start cold calling anyone who looks like in the yellow page directory could maybe tell me about what's going on. And I set up 40 meetings over the course of 7 days, and I hadn't met anybody who would meet with me. And by the end of my 40 meetings, I discovered that the Russian privatization program was and always will be the single most compelling investment opportunity that's ever existed in the history of capital markets. And what I had learned was that they made this political decision to go from communism to capitalism. But just declaring themselves capitalist doesn't do you much good unless you can somehow bring the process along. And so what they decided to do was to make everybody a capitalist. And the way they did that was they gave away these vouchers, these physical vouchers, these certificates to every person in the country. Every person got a voucher. And And so the vouchers, they're kind of like cash. You could buy them, you could sell them, you could trade them, you could do whatever you want with them. And like a secondary market emerged for these vouchers for $20 each. And so there's 150 million people in the country, 150 million vouchers, times $20 gets you to $3 billion worth of vouchers. And those $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of the share capital of all Russian companies, which meant that the market cap of Russia this was 1992, was $10 billion. And this is a country with 30% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil. There's 10% of the world's steel, aluminum, electricity, fertilizer, car companies, banks, everything. The entire country, $10 billion. You couldn't buy a mid-sized oil company in Oklahoma for $10 billion. You could buy the entire country of Russia. And that's when I realized that I needed to just go all in on this whole thing.
Wow, that is quite the origin story. So going from a communist background to doing arguably the most capitalistic thing and becoming an investment banker, to then realizing the entire market cap of Russia is less than that of a medium-sized oil company in the middle of Oklahoma.
Yeah.
That is quite a span of 10 years. And so I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about, coming out of the GSB, you're going to be an investment banker, you're working in Moscow, and then you have this epiphany of what a great investment opportunity. What gave you the confidence that you were the one who could really capitalize on this opportunity?
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing is that, am I allowed to talk about the family relations?
Go for it.
So Rachel's dad, Ken, is my classmate right over there, Ken Hirsch, was my classmate in GSB. We were great friends and poker buddies, and Ken wanted to. Ken was very entrepreneurial, and he really wanted to start a business the minute the stepping out of business school, and I was really I didn't feel entrepreneurial at all. I didn't have any confidence about any of this kind of stuff, and so, but I was I was sitting there, and well actually. There's a good, so the way my entrepreneurialism came was from this dysfunction of being inside this big organization. So I'm working at Salomon Brothers, and I discovered that it's all very, very real, this investment opportunity. And so I rush back to London where the office was, and I go to the first person I see and I say, we've got to stop everything else we're doing and invest in Russian equities, and I mean, this was. I mean, that would sound pretty weird 5 years ago, but 25 years ago, that's just insanity, or 35 years ago, I should say. And so the moment I said Russian equities, before I could explain all this math of everything, that person switched off. And I don't have any. I didn't. And I don't think I do today have any really good organizational political skills. I'm not really bad in a big company, and so. One person said no, and so I went to the next person, and I said, we got to stop everything else. And shut me down. And by the time I'd gone to 10 people, I'd completely discredited myself inside the whole organization. And who is this guy? That's that crazy guy who wants to invest in Russian equities. And Salomon Brothers was a place where if you weren't, so the deal was very simple. You've got to earn for the firm 5 times what we pay you, or otherwise you get fired. Just simple as that. And there's no training program or anything like that. Just and I wasn't earning 5 times what they were paying me. I don't think I was even earning what they were paying me. And I was this crazy guy talking about investing in Russia, and so I was the clock was ticking, and I was going to be fired, and then. One day, and I was just thinking, this is terrible. I really think we should be investing in this stuff, and this is obvious. It's in your face obvious, and I thought I'm going to be fired, and so not only am I not going to be able to invest in this stuff, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, and I was really feeling pretty sorry for myself. And one day my phone rings, and it's a very senior partner in the New York office of Salomon Brothers. And he said, I hear you have some career difficulties, but you might have something interesting to say about Russia. Can you come to New York and explain to me what's going on? And so I think this is my chance to save myself. And so I prepared the most beautiful PowerPoint presentation I could ever prepare on just showing how cheap it was, everything in Russia. And then I rehearsed it in my apartment, and then I rehearsed it on the airplane, and I rehearsed it in the bathroom in the hotel before going there. And I arrive in this guy's office, and Solomon Brothers, and I sit down and I start to like go through my presentation, and he's the strangest fellow, this person who I hadn't met before, and he had a very high title, but he had no social skills at all. And so I started going through the presentation, and he just stared at me blankly. There was no nodding, no ahhing, no asking me questions of any sort. And so I get through about 20 pages of my presentation, and without any feedback at all, and he just gets up and leaves the room.
That's good.
And my career is like on the line here. I think this is like this is my chance to save my career, and I obviously screwed it up. And I thought I really thought I had done the best job I could have done with this presentation and all this stuff. And so I'm just like thinking, what am I? He's going to come back eventually. I got to figure out how to salvage this meeting because this is my only chance. And he's gone for 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes, and 30 minutes. It's getting kind of ridiculous. Do I even stick around? And they're like, what? So, and like 45 minutes later, he comes back, and I'm about to blurt something out to save my career. And before I have a chance to say anything, he says very calmly, he said, I've just gone to the risk management committee of Solomon Brothers, and I've got you $25 million to invest. I'd like you to stop doing everything else you're doing and just get to work investing this money. And it's like the cloud had lifted off my shoulders. And so I go and invest the money, and it's just been, and so we get the money invested. And then The Economist magazine writes an article called Sale of the Century, where they describe the same math I just shared with you about the voucher program. And all of a sudden, about 20 either rich guys, proprietary trading desks, hedge funds, all show up after reading the article and decide they want to all buy Russian equities as a result of this article. And it's a tiny little, the Russian stock market was a tiny little illiquid, untransparent market. And you get these 20 sort of clumsy investors all coming in at the same time. What happens? The share price goes up of everything. And so over the course of 3 weeks, the $25 million portfolio turns into $125 million. And this is back in the days when $100 million of profit was real money. And so all of a sudden, everybody starts coming around to my desk and wanting to know how to make their 5 times their money. And Solomon Brothers was a really like rude place. Everyone was very rude to each other. It was like this really very just dog-eat-dog, the epitome of like Wall Street in its worst possible way. And people are very disrespectful. So anyways, but people started coming by my desk and these like senior salespeople, and they say, Mr. Browder. They wouldn't say, Browder or whatever. Mr. Browder, I know your time is very valuable, but is there any chance you could possibly share a little bit of your precious time with my client, Mr. Soros? He'd be so grateful. Mr. Browder, Sir John Templeton would be just, he knows you're so busy, but could you just come around? And so I went on this world tour of people from Wall Street, and they all, and I went through my presentation, and they were much quicker than my Solomon Brothers colleagues, and they looked at the stuff and said, "This is unbelievable. Can we give you some money to manage?" And I said, "I don't know. We're just doing this for ourselves, but I can go back and find out." So I go back to the head of the trading floor in London, and I say, George Soros asked me if we could manage some money for him in Russia. And the head of the trading floor says, "Brilliant idea. Let's form a task force to study it." And so I show up in the first task force meeting in this conference room, and it's just packed. There's like 45 people in this conference room, and like 40 of them I've never seen before in my life. There's like the vice chairman of the firm, the senior managing directors, senior directors, senior vice presidents, and me. I was like an associate. And within moments of the meeting starting, a fight breaks out about who's going to get the economic credit for the business. And the investment bankers are amazingly great at like arguing for money they don't deserve. And so you have these like, the asset management division said this absolutely should be ours, and the investment banking said, well, he works in investment banking, emerging markets. Everyone had incredible arguments, and I wasn't sure who was going to win these arguments and who was going to get the economic credit, but I was absolutely 100% sure of who wasn't going to get any economic credit, and that was going to be me. And so how did I become an entrepreneur? Well, I got so pissed off that this dysfunctional institution that I decided I was, and I knew all these guys. So I figured some of these guys who wanted to give me money to manage didn't want to give Solomon Brothers money to manage, wanted to give me money to manage. And so I took a leap. I've never had any entrepreneurial instincts at all, and I hung out the shingle, and one of the guys, a guy named Edmund Safra, who was the owner of Republic National Bank of New York, he gave me the first $25 million, and I moved to Moscow and started the fund. And it wasn't like a private equity fund, it was like a hedge fund, so you could put money in at any time. And we started with $25 million, and in the first 18 months, we were up 835%. We went from $25 million to $1 billion of assets under management. My fund was the best performing fund in the world in 1997, and I was all of 31 years old.
Wow. A little more than earning back that 5 times your salary.
Solomon Brothers didn't get any of it.
There we go. Take that and turn that into a business school class. How did it feel when you were going from this juxtaposition to going from asking Solomon Brothers to say, let's put dollars into Russian equities, to all of a sudden people begging you to put dollars into your fund? What was that sort of meteoric transition like?
Well, it was crazy, and I think that these types of things happen now. Like these cryptocurrency fads or whatever. It was a fad, and it went for. I mean, everybody just started piling into this stuff, and I was really unprepared for it. So I was, as I said, I was 31 years old. I was on the front page of the business section of the Financial Times and the New York Times. I was some kind of like financial genius. My clients were sending their private jets to shuttle me back to the south of France to toast me on their yachts. And if you put all this stuff together, best performing fund manager in the world, the toasting on the yachts, all this kind of stuff. You put all this stuff into the hands of a 31-year-old. That is the biggest sell signal there ever was. But of course, I didn't see it, and I thought my $1 billion was going to go to $10 billion, and everything was going to be amazing. And that was going into 1998. And for those of you who have any memory of emerging markets, 1998 was the year that the Russian government defaulted on their bonds, devalued their currency by 75%, and my $1 billion portfolio went down 90%. I lost $900 million of my clients' money, and that was a very sobering moment in my life.
I can't even imagine. So if you were to go back and give 31-year-old Bill Browder some advice, what would you say?
Well, if I would go back and give 25-year-old Bill Browder some advice, I would have said, instead of leaving California to go to Russia, stay in California.
Fair enough. That's honestly a great transition into talking more about your business in Russia as a whole, and Anat mentioned earlier a little bit about Sergei Magnitsky. What the work that you've done since his passing to honor his legacy is truly astounding. Could you possibly share with us a little bit more about his story and how you ultimately decided to pursuing the Magnitsky Act afterwards, how that came to be?
So after the crash of 1998, one of the things that started happening in grand proportions was that the Russian oligarchs, these guys who they're not nice people, they own a majority share of all the companies in Russia, pretty much. I owned tiny minorities, they owned the majority, and they had kind of behaved themselves when the market was rising, because all these fancy investment bankers were going to them and saying, if you behave yourself, we can maybe get you some money from Wall Street, free money from Wall Street, effectively. And so the oligarchs had kind of behaved themselves, but once the crash happened, they called up their bankers, say, we need that free money you were offering. And the bankers were saying, I'm sorry, Vladimir who? And would put the phone down. And they realized that there was, that Wall Street was closed for business. And so there was no longer any incentive to behave. And in Russia, there is no real legal incentive or legal disincentive against misbehavior. And so if you're a rational oligarch who stole the companies in the first place, why wouldn't you just steal everything that's not nailed down? And so they embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They're doing asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlement, dilutions, and they're doing it on a massive scale. And there I was sitting there with my last 10 cents on the dollar. We had gone from $1 billion down to 100 million, and they were going to try to steal the last 100 million. And so as a matter of necessity, I became an anti-corruption activist to try to prevent them from stealing. And the way that I went about doing that was to research how they went about the stealing. And I had a really great team of analysts working for me, mostly Russians. And then we would share that research with the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And journalists loved me because I was doing their homework for them. And they would write these stories. And so it could have had no effect. I mean, there's lots of stories in the world where you expose corruption and nothing happens. In fact, we see them here in America. But in this particular case, it was right around the time that Vladimir Putin had just come to power, and he had a problem. He had the same problem I had in a different area, which was that he was president of Russia, but he wasn't really president of Russia because all the powers of the presidency had been informally taken away from him by the oligarchs. They had stolen this power that he had, and so he wanted to bring the power back to the presidency, and so. They were stealing power from him. They were stealing money from me. There's an expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And I've never met Vladimir Putin then, and I haven't met him since then, but every time we would publicize one of these scandals, we were doing it against one of his arch enemies. And so he would step in using whatever powers he had, issue presidential decrees, vote state shares if the state had majority or whatever, and try to stop these scams. And it was actually a really beautiful thing because every time he would step in, the share price would go up. And I thought he was a really great guy. I mean, look, he's. And by the way, so I started with 25 million. We go up to $1 billion. We crash to 100 million, and then I start doing this naming and shaming campaigns, and we go from 100 million to $4.5 billion. And so we're making money hand over fist for our clients, for ourselves. We're making Russia a better place. I'm feeling really good about myself and feeling good about Putin and feeling good about Russia, and I'm wishing that it's never going to end. But it turned out that Putin wasn't doing this because he wanted to make Russia a better place. He was doing this because he didn't like the oligarchs. And he decided to go out to win his war with the oligarchs. And the way he did that was to arrest the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He arrests him off his private jet in Siberia. He brings him back to Moscow. He puts him on trial. And in Russia, there's a 99.7% conviction rate in a criminal case. And so when you're on trial, you sit in a cage because that's where you're going to be when the trial is over. And they allow the television cameras to come in and film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. And when he was sentenced to 10 years in jail, all the other oligarchs panicked. And they went to Putin and said, well, the whole country was of the assumption that if you're an oligarch, you're more important than the president. All of a sudden, the president has arrested the richest oligarch, and so the message was, you could also go to jail. And so they all go to Putin and say, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't go to jail? And he said, real simple, 50%. And that was the moment that Putin became the richest man in the world. That was the moment that my interests and his diverged. And I kept on with my naming and shaming campaigns, but I was no longer going after his enemies. I was going after his 50% economic interest. And in November 2005, as I was flying back to Moscow from a weekend trip to London, I was arrested at the border. I was put in the airport detention center overnight. And then the next day, they deported me back to London and declared me a threat to national security. At that point, I evacuated all my staff. And then we quickly and quietly liquidated our entire portfolio in Russia and got all of our money out. So I got my staff out, got our money out. I thought that was the end of the story. Mm-hmm. It turns out it was just the beginning of the most terrible nightmare. After that, my offices were raided. The police seized all of our documents. And the next thing we knew, we no longer owned our investment holding companies, the companies through which we had invested our money. The police seized the documents for those companies, and then they fraudulently re-registered those companies out of our name into the name of a man convicted of manslaughter and let out of jail early to put his name on these documents. And this was the point when I realized that even though there was no financial impact on me, that if the police were working with criminals to steal my companies, I'm going to be walking through Frankfurt Airport one day and I'm going to be arrested on a Russian warrant if I don't do something about this. And so I go out and hire the smartest lawyer I know in Russia, a guy named Sergei Magnitsky. He was 37 years old. When I hired him, he was 35 years old. And I said to Sergei, I don't know what they're doing, but this feels pretty sinister. Can you help me figure it out and stop it? And so Sergei goes and researches the whole thing, investigates top to bottom, and he figures out what they were trying to do. And basically, they tried to steal all of my money, but my money was safe. But then the next thing they did was they took our companies. So when we sold everything, after I'd been kicked out, we had a huge capital gain. We had $1 billion profit, and we paid $230 million of capital gains tax to the Russian government. And what Sergei had figured out was that the people who stole our companies went back to the tax authorities in 2007, and they said there has actually been a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion, they earned $0. And they came up with some sort of weird way of explaining that to the tax authorities. They said, therefore, the companies that paid $230 million in the previous year paid that money in error, and we'd like that money back. And so they applied for a $230 million tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And it was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, and it was approved and paid out the next day. And Sergei figured this out, and we were both convinced this must be a rogue operation. We thought that this wasn't our money that was stolen, this was the Russian government's money that was stolen. And so we said we need to expose it. And so we wrote criminal complaints to every different law enforcement agency in Russia. I went to the media, to the state, to the television, radio, newspapers told the whole story, and Sergei testified against the officials involved at the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. It turns out that there are no good guys in Russia. Same guys Sergei testified against came to his home 5 weeks later, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then began to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds. They left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. And the purpose of this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers and to get him to sign a false confession to say that he had stolen the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. Sergei was a man of incredible integrity, and for him the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more awful than the physical pain they were subjecting him to, and he refused. And the torture and the pressure got worse and worse. After about 6 months, he ended up developing terrible pains in his stomach, feeling really sick. He ended up losing 40 pounds, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, they come to him again, ask him to sign a false confession. Again, he refuses. They abruptly, in retaliation, they move him to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be the worst prison in Russia. And at Butyrka, they have no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. No operation on his pancreatitis. He and his lawyers desperately begged for medical attention. All of their requests are either ignored or denied in writing. And on the night of November 16th, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore. And so they put him in an ambulance, sent him to a different prison facility across town that had a medical wing. But instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. That was almost 15 years ago. And that was the tragedy that changed my life. I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to put aside everything I was doing in my business and devote all of my time, energy, and resources going after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. And it's led to this piece of legislation, which called the Magnitsky Act, named after Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes the assets and bans the travel of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who commit similar human rights abuses. And it was totally unexpected and remarkable that I was able to get this legislation passed in the United States in 2012. Putin went out of his mind when this law passed. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act, and then he started going after me with a vengeance, with death threats, kidnapping threats, Interpol arrest warrants, extradition requests, lawsuits, et cetera. And he thought by going after these, going after the adoptions, by going after me, that we would all back off and he could somehow turn the whole situation around. My congressional allies in this whole thing were even more energized to do more, not just in the United States, but in other countries. And I was not intimidated. And so since then, there are 35 countries that have Magnitsky Acts around the world. And the Magnitsky Act has now turned into the legislation which is used to sanction all the Russian oligarchs and Russian officials involved in the invasion of Ukraine. It's been broadened so it doesn't just apply to Russia, it applies to China, applies to Venezuela, applies to Nicaragua, and all sorts of bad guys all over the world are sanctioned. And there's a lot of bad guys in the world who haven't been sanctioned, who are scared of being sanctioned. And it's hard to know whether it's been a deterrent or not, but I'd like to think that there are people who have been asked to do terrible things that chose not to because they didn't want to have their worldwide assets frozen.
Right. Well, first, thank you for your incredible work to get this legislation passed and serving Sergei's honor in getting this through a variety of different countries. And one of the biggest things themes that we discuss at CASI is really the intermingling of business and democracy and rule of law. And how do you think that in a business setting, do you think democracy and the rule of law is undervalued in today's business landscape?
That's a really good way of putting it. I made all of my money in public markets, in emerging markets. And after what I've seen, I don't have a penny invested in emerging markets. That doesn't mean that one shouldn't invest in emerging markets, but people undervalue rule of law. So I mean, China was always like a big thing for a long time. It isn't anymore, but China was a big thing, and I always told everybody China's uninvestable because basically, what is an investment? An investment is when you take a risk in the hope that you put money into the ground in the hope that it then generates lots more money later on. But if you're in a place where there's no rule of law, then when it generates all that money, once the risk is over, all that money that's being generated, people want to have it that didn't take the risk. And if you go to a place that doesn't have a rule of law, like China, and it's not just China, there's many other, I would say the same thing is true in the Middle East, and the same thing is true in lots of countries. How do you deal with that incentive thing where everyone wants to steal your money? And you can't go to court. In China, you can't go to court. You can't go to the media. You can't go to the parliament. And so what do? You're a sitting duck. And so how do you evaluate that risk? There's no way to calculate that risk unless it's just so ridiculously cheap that you think maybe there's a 70% chance you're going to lose your money, but if a 30% chance happens you don't, you make a lot of money. But I would argue that's speculation. That's not investment. And and speculation is fine, but it's not investment. And so I think that democracy, rule of law, media freedom are all absolute components of having any type of investment case. You can't really have an investment case unless you have that stuff.
And as you look around to the geopolitical environment today, do you see a world in which democracy is backsliding in any capacity?
Yeah, everywhere.
Wow. Everywhere.
I mean, it's remarkable what's happening. And so I've been living in Europe for the last 35 years, and you've got Hungary, which was occupied by the Soviets in 1956, and you've got this sort of mini dictator, Viktor Orban, who wants to basically become part of Russia again, and of course you see what Putin is doing in Ukraine, and if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he'll then roll out his version of klepto-fascism to any place that he can occupy, and then you have these weird people in Britain we have this guy Nigel Farage who, he thinks that Putin is a great guy, and the new prime minister of Slovakia thinks Putin's a great guy. Orban thinks Putin's a great guy, and there's some person around here who
We don't need to talk politics, that's okay. I have one last question, not to leave it on a somber note, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So we've talked about a lot of really serious topics, but is there anything that has you excited for the next year, the next 5 years? You're going to get to celebrate your 35th reunion in some capacity?
Yeah, I mean, what a great thing. I mean, to come back and see all my pals. There's a bunch of them in the audience today. I've got a couple of my kids here. My daughter Sophia over there is a freshman here, and my son Josh graduated from Stanford and is running a great entrepreneurial business. I got a bunch more kids who are all doing great things, and I've been given this totally unexpected title, which is very, very helpful in getting hotel reservations and getting meetings with people. I'm now a full-time human rights activist, and I can I can ask people for meetings, and they give me meetings that they never would before because of this title, and I can I'm swinging a lot harder now. So yeah, there's the bad guys are still after me, and I've got to look over my shoulder, and I've got to be careful. But I'm working on. So I have a mission in my life, which I feel like is a righteous mission. I get up every day excited to do the things I do and do good things and help people, and I feel like I have purpose in my life, and that makes life, I feel good about that.
Well, we're very thankful to have had you here. So quick round of applause for Sir William. And now we'll open it up to Q&A. And we'll let you choose.
Well, you choose.
I choose, okay.
Without trying to do this apolitically, objectively, imagine a world in which Trump is elected for the secretary.
Oh my God.
Roll out what you think happens, right?
Well, we don't have to be imaginative. He's told us what's going to happen. He says that he's going to cut off funding for Ukraine. If Ukraine runs out of military aid, they run out of ammunition, and if they run out of ammunition, then Russia eventually will win the war in Ukraine and will occupy a big part of Ukraine. When that happens, in my opinion, Putin it doesn't stop. It's not like he said, "I've achieved my objectives, I can go back." His objectives were to be at war, and if he's won Ukraine, then he's got to have another challenge. And so, what's his next challenge? He's already stated it. He doesn't like the fact that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are not part of Russia, and so he has a go at them. And they're members of NATO. And so what happens when he crosses the border into Estonia? Then we're faced with a question: do we decide to defend our NATO? Estonia's got a population of 1 million. Most Americans couldn't identify Estonia on a map. And so is America going to go to war with Russia over a country that a million-person country that most people can't identify on a map, with a president who doesn't like to be a member of NATO and has said so, and who has also said that he's sort of partial to Putin? I think that there's a pretty good chance. Well, one of two things happens: either it's catastrophic and we go to war with Russia, or it's catastrophic and we don't go to war with Russia, and Putin then can roll right into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and perhaps Poland, and then we're back to like 1945 type of thing. And by the way, who's watching this whole thing play itself out? The Chinese. And what are the Chinese doing? Well, they've got their eye on Taiwan, and they think, well, if America's going to let Ukraine go, then why would they get involved with Taiwan? And then so they take Taiwan. And then all of a sudden, what does Taiwan do that's so special? They produce all the chips in the world. And all of a sudden, China then has a stranglehold on America with the chips. And so I think we're in for a world of hurt if, someone called me up. I went through the same scenario on MSNBC last week, and a friend of mine who's a big Trump supporter called me up and said, "Bill, you should understand that we should watch his actions, not his words. And maybe that's one way to be hopeful, is that he doesn't actually do what he says he's going to do. But if he does anything close to what he says he's going to do, we're in for really a nasty situation as far as foreign policy is concerned.
How about domestically?
Well,
Economically?
I mean, I have my opinions like everybody else. I'm not an expert on that stuff, but I mean, as you can tell, let me tell you a story that's very personal, though, which is that when Trump met Putin in 2018 at the summit, at the Helsinki summit, it was right after Robert Mueller had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers, and so the obvious question to Putin is, are you going to hand over these people who Robert Mueller has indicted, who were interfered in the U.S. election? And so the question was asked by a Reuters journalist, and Putin said, well, it's possible we would hand them over, but if we did, we would expect some goodwill and reciprocity from our American friends. And specifically, we would expect them to hand over Bill Browder, me. And then the obvious next question went to Trump. So, Mr. President, what do you think of this offer? And he said, I think it's an incredible offer. And it took a vote of the Senate 4 days later, 98-0, not to hand me over before that whole thing. And so I'm as you can tell, I'm not a big Trump supporter.
Adam?
Thanks for sharing your story. When you were buying these vouchers at $20 a voucher, clearly prices were not efficient. How did you think about the Russians on the other side of the trade?
Well, I mean, it was sort of like a public market, and so I don't know who the Russians were on the other side of the trade. I mean, so the way that I mean, it's like if you bought Apple shares when they were trading at $5. I mean, there's somebody selling, somebody buying. I mean, it's a lot of people say, should you have bought those? Was that unethical? And I think that if there's a public market, I'm not like jipping somebody out of their shares. I'm just going to an exchange. I didn't really think of the people on the other side of the trade. I was just thinking that that's the market price of those vouchers, and anyone could buy them. It was a level playing field, total transparency, buy, sell. That's the price. Obviously, people shouldn't have sold those vouchers because, But having said that, I'm just in Azerbaijan they had a voucher program, and everybody thought that they were going to include the state oil company. Azerbaijan was much different than Russia. There was only one asset that anyone would wanted to buy, which was the state oil company, SOCAR. And so a bunch of people bought a bunch of vouchers in Azerbaijan, and then one day they decided that the state oil company wasn't going to be included, and all the vouchers were worthless. So I mean, there was some risk, quite a bit of risk actually, just to owning these things.
Hi, thank you for being here. As a Russian citizen myself, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about what you predict will happen from a domestic political standpoint within Russia, and whether sanctions are an effective tool. And in the wake of Alexei Navalny's death, do you feel like there's any sort of positive hope for the country?
Yeah, well, so Alexei Navalny was a friend of mine, and he was, I think, he was genuinely the most popular politician in Russia. Putin's not a politician. Putin is a dictator. And if there had been a free and fair election, Alexei Navalny would probably have won with 80% of the vote. And by killing Alexei Navalny, it really was a horrific action that extinguished a lot of hope for a lot of people in Russia. I'm not particularly positive or optimistic about what's going to happen. I mean, basically, the longer Putin is in power, the more desperate he is to stay in power. And the more desperate he is to stay in power, the more repressions and awful things he's going to do. And I would say that there's scenarios. The most likely scenario is that he's able to hold it all together in the same way as Kim Jong-un or the Iranian dictatorship holds it together. And he's still there 12 years from now, and Russia's a lot closer to North Korea than it is to a normal European country in 12 years from now. That's the most likely scenario. But the more he turns the screws on people, the more people who get killed in war. And I think the latest numbers I've read from the Ukrainian estimates are 682,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the last 2.5 years, which is just an unbelievable amount of people dead. And I don't know how a country can do that except in a dictatorship. But the more people that get killed, the more the sanctions bite, and Putin puts on a brave face and said the sanctions aren't hurting. The sanctions are definitely hurting. There's $300 billion of central bank reserves that are frozen. Russia's completely cut off from the international capital markets. There are all sorts of things that can't be produced anymore because there's no bans on export. 1 million able-bodied young men have left the country. Russia has 20% interest rates because inflation is so high. And they have 2% unemployment because everyone's either dead or gone, which creates an overheating economy. 40% of the government budget is spent on military, 7% of GDP. It's a messy situation. But what all Putin has to do is just outlast us. And he's ready to sacrifice another 682,000 people if that's what it takes, or another one after that. He just doesn't care. He just does not care. And the problem is that we're all democracies, and people get, we have, people, we all have our own financial issues and taxes we don't want to pay, and budgets that we have to balance, and all this kind of stuff. And so, the idea that we can go on funding Ukraine all Putin has to do is outlast us, and it feels like he's outlasting us, and so I don't have any great hopes at all for Russia. But there is the chance scenario that it all blows up, and we saw a moment where it almost all blew up in June of last year, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, started marching towards Rostov. He was having a fight with the other military leaders, and then all of a sudden people were putting flowers on his tanks and taking their selfies with him, and he realized that he could have actually he marched halfway to Moscow, and then they took his wife and daughter hostage, and he stopped the march. But that could have been the coup that unseated Putin, and something like that could happen. My fantasy was that Ukraine would have a military victory, Putin would be discredited, and then the Russian people would turn on Putin, and that they would break Alexei Navalny out of jail, and he would become the next leader of Russia. And of course, that didn't happen, but anything could happen in a situation like this. But the probability is pretty low, unfortunately.
When reading your book, and just, everything's very heroic and everything's very clean, but I mean, what's really amazing is what it takes and what it took to get the asset freezes that you got, to have all these people working and essentially doing law enforcement work, connecting all these databases and these bank accounts, and so can you give a little bit of we'll talk more about this tomorrow in an interview in more detail, but explain money laundering a little bit. It's in the title of your book. Explain what it takes to, why it's possible to do, what does Panama paper has to do with it, a little more granular on that.
So the big, most well-known project to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky was the Magnitsky Act. But the other thing which we did was we said, who got the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over? And I'm going to make sure that every person who got that money, and every person who laundered that money, and every person who touched that money rue the day that they had anything to do with it. And one of the guys who worked for me, who was a great securities analyst, he's a super smart guy, Russian guy named Vadim, and I said, I want you to figure this out. And so he, for the last, I guess, since for the last 15 years, he's been working on this, and full time. And we got little leads here and there, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Azeri laundromat, the Russian laundromat. And then whistleblowers started coming forward, people who were involved, and said, we've got some documents we want to show you. And we started taking this information, and then we would take it to, if we found out some money went to some country, we would then file a criminal complaint in that country. And then sometimes, not always, but sometimes, most of the time, but the law enforcement authorities would open a criminal investigation. And in many countries, and particularly in Europe, they have what's called civil law instead of common law. And civil law means that we get, as a complainant, we get access to the criminal case file. So they would start investigating it, and then we would get access to that, and we discover that the accounts that they put into the criminal case file would tell us money went to the next country, and then we'd take that and file a complaint with the next country, and pretty soon we were able to put the whole thing together, and we found that money went to 26 different countries. We filed those criminal complaints with 26 countries. 16 countries opened criminal investigations, and I would say if we look at all the fines, money frozen, confiscations, et cetera, about $100 million was either frozen or confiscated from all these bad guys. And the most interesting thing was that the first major bank that we discovered the money going through was a Danish bank called Danske Bank Estonia. It went through their Estonian branch. 200 million of the $230 million went through Danske Bank. And so we filed a criminal complaint with the Danish and Estonian authorities. That created a whole bunch of press. And we got a call from a Danish investigative journalist team, and they said, we've just gotten a huge leak of data from Danske Bank. Can you share with us your criminal complaint, because we can't make sense of it, but if we could, we might be able to identify more money that was stolen from Russia. So we work regularly with journalists as we handed over our criminal complaint. They went and compared it with their database, and they came back and said it wasn't $200 million of dirty money that was laundered through Danske Bank, it was $8.3 billion. And Denmark is considered by Transparency International to be the second most honest country in the world after New Zealand. And so you can't exactly just be the CEO of this company and say fake news and like move on. And so the CEO of the company had to then go in and hire an external accounting firm, an external law firm, an external data analysis firm, and he lifted the hood and allowed everybody to look at everything. And they came back and said, actually, it wasn't 8.3 billion. It was 232 billion that was laundered through Danske Bank. And this is just one medium-sized Scandinavian bank that we could lift the hood on and look underneath and see what was going on. And so if you could lift the hood on Raiffeisen in Austria, which does a huge amount of money laundering, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, UBS, ABN AMRO, and a few others, I think the amount would be closer to $1 trillion that was stolen from Russia. And this is like Putin and 1,000 guys around him have stolen $1 trillion that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads, and public services. Instead, it was spent on private jets, villas, and yachts. And that's the reason why Putin went to war. Putin understood that in a country where people sort of expect it to be a democracy, where you have 141 million people living in destitute poverty, and you have 1,000 people with all the money in the world, all it's going to take is a match, and it's like gasoline on the floor, and the whole thing is going to come light up. And so Putin didn't want to sit around like waiting for something terrible to happen. And so what does he do? Machiavelli 101. He creates a foreign enemy and starts a war. Ukrainians. This is not about NATO enlargement. The Ukraine war is not about an empire, Russian empire. It's about a little man who's stolen too much money, who's scared of his own people, and understands that if he loses power, he loses all of his money, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so he doesn't want to die. And so what does he do? He starts a war. And that realization, and by the way, that analysis of why he's at war would be the same analysis that Alexei Navalny would have shared if he was still alive today. The same analysis that Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Anybody who knows the situation understands that the war in Ukraine is all about staying in power. And so all these fantasies about ending the war in one day with a negotiation is just fantasy. This war is not going to end in one day. It's not going to end because Putin needs to be at war in order to stay in power.
Well, fortunately, we're out of time. Again, thank you so much for coming, and we applaud the work that you're doing around the world.